Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Boston Society for Architecture's Matter and Opinion, our 7-session series on existing buildings, which focuses on climate action and building the will to save the world through the use of existing buildings. I'm Jean Caroon. I'm a principal at Goody Clancy, a Boston architecture planning and preservation firm, and I'm honored to be moderating our second session today. Today, we're focusing on commercial workplaces and why existing buildings matter in developer-driven projects. And you're going to see 2 terrific projects. And through the rest of August, the series will look into education facilities, higher education and K-12, into workplaces, both commercial and mission-driven, and housing, both residential and multifamily. But before we go further, I particularly like to thank our sponsor. The Boston Society for Architecture couldn't do these kind of programs without sponsorship, and we appreciate the Spalding Brick Companies stepping forward to make this series possible. I'd also like to thank our partners within the AIA community and others. We have AIA Central Massachusetts, who are hosting the AIA New England Design Awards this year, AIA Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, Western Massachusetts, and more locally, the Boston Preservation Alliance and Built Environment Plus, and the Boston chapter for the International Facilities Management Association. Just a reminder that we are recording this session and that your registration and attendance include your consent to the BSA's image and content release policy. We will share this session later this week for you to access on architects.org, and we'll notify you by email once it's posted. If you would like to receive continuing education or certification for attending today, please fill out the short Google form. A link will be entered in the chat. I'd also like to thank our behind the scenes, Caitlin Hart, who is the BSA logo you see. Without her, none of this would be possible, and she makes it easy. I would also particularly like to thank our speakers, some of whom are doing this while they're on vacation, and they make it really possible for this to happen. But while we're on the topic of existing buildings, I want to plug another series that the BSA is hosting this summer, Reopenings, celebrating new architecture that is in or in addition to an existing building. The remaining sessions are taking place on actually, the last one is on this coming Wednesday on August 4th. So we hope you can share our enthusiasm and conversations around that. This session and the series are about building the well around existing buildings among all the constituents by investigating hurdles to and benefits of existing building work, so we can determine what we best need as owners, builders, architects, and advocates to embrace existing buildings as the climate solution. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first set of speakers who are going to focus on Congress Square, a development here in Boston. And many of you probably already know Kate Bubriski, the Director of Sustainability and Building Performance at Arrowstreet, and Amy Korte, the President of Arrowstreet. So thank you, Amy and Kate. And we'll look forward to, I can't wait to see your presentation. Oh, I'm sorry, Caitlin. She wants me to introduce all the speakers right at once. So next slide. Sorry, Caitlin. The post at 200 Smith will have 3 speakers. Christina Dubrule, who's an associate interior designer at CBT. Andrew Marr, who's co-founder and managing partner at Anchorline Partners, who is on vacation on the Cape, which you'll see his beautiful setting when he speaks. And thank you particularly, Andrew, for making the effort to do this for us. We really appreciate it. And Maren Reepmeyer, who is an associate principal and director of adaptive design at CBT. So with that, I think we can begin the presentations, and I'll be back on to talk about question and answers. If you have questions, please post them to the chat, and we will look forward to having a conversation at the end of both presentations. Thanks. Bye.
Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And I will be talking about Congress Square. It's a project we did for Related Beal back in 2013. That's when we started the project. It's constructed around 2018, 2019, I think opened. So it's been as all these projects are, a while in the making. For those of you who don't know where Congress Square is, it's in the middle of downtown Boston, marked by the center orange area, really smack in the middle of the Central Business Improvement District. Great relationships to transit. And it really is almost the entire block that we got permitted, approved, and did a series of adaptive reuse proposals for both vertical additions and horizontal additions on the buildings that were in the block. Probably the best known building of these is the National Shawmut Bank building. It was originally an example of an early skyscraper in Boston. It was described by the Globe at the time when it was built as really one of Boston's most imposing structures and a monument to the banking industry. And so, you know, what we went in with as a building to add a vertical addition to was really fairly closed off from the street. It had a number of grills around the window and didn't really have a lot of its building floor levels matching and meeting that street. And this was really one of 7 turn of the century historic buildings that were on the block. And it was also joined by Quaker Lane, which was marked in yellow in the bottom right-hand corner of this image. And so really National Shawmut Bank, which is also known as 40 Water Street or 33 Congress, depending on what era of plans you're looking at, was eventually expanded by Shawmut Bank into a series of 3 to 4 buildings that circled this entire complex. And they were connected through a light well in the center of the building, which ultimately became important to how we did a vertical addition on top, taking advantage of that light well. And then there were 2 other smaller blocks, 15 and 19 Congress, that we got approved as residential with a small vertical addition on top of 15 Congress. And 54 and 68 Devonshire. 68 Devonshire had this gorgeous building called the Newport Building, which we turned into the Hyatt Centric and did a horizontal addition, is what it's called, on the empty lot next to it, and basically connected the interior of that building. And so this project for us was the permanent approvals of the entire block and then taking 54 and 68 Devonshire to construction with Hyatt Centric, and then 40 Water Street to its construction as a new office tower with Related Beal, and then 15 and 19 Congress were sold off. I think most of the architects in the city have now touched it at this point. So when it comes back, you know the history for this. And another kind of fun fact about this, we dug through a ton of old drawings on this project. This was originally known as Congress Square, hence the title. Quaker Lane was called Congress Square, which is why we rebranded it as that. So you can see the different building areas on this image here. And so when we started on this project, it was being marketed really as the block on Congress. And what was being proposed was a 35-story office tower that really only left the facade of Congress Square. It was really that traditional facade-ectomy. There was a couple proposals in what CBRE was marketing, anywhere from an office tower to a residential plus hotel. And really what that looked like, if you look at a diagram of the block was 15 and 19 Congress would have been demolished, 68 Devonshire, which is the future Hyatt Centric, would have been demolished. A significant portion of 40 Water would have been demolished, in Quaker Lane, which is really significant as a historic street because it's unusual in a lot of these Boston blocks to have these connecting streets, which bring opportunities for multi-sided retail and light and air to really get to the center of the block. And so as we worked with Related Beal as part of the due diligence phase, we're really asking ourselves, what could you do to look at what makes this area, the city block in Boston, so special, and how do we use those historic elements to really attract future tenants and future activity to revitalize the center of downtown Boston. So on Quaker Lane, there are really these fabulous copper fire escapes that run up and down the backsides of 15 and 19 Congress that are just gorgeous. I mean, this intricate metalwork, bronze kind of metalwork all along the front of Congress Square, along with these bronze doors, and then this kind of really nice copper patinaed parapet that was very delicate, and we worked to save that as we inserted the addition on top of the building. And the reason I show you all this is this really became, you know, I would say part of the allure for what made this block special, how it differentiated itself from all the new construction that was happening at that time in the Seaport, and really became a defining factor for how Related attracted tenants to the space. We were part of a lot of those marketing and leasing tours, and the tenants would walk through, see these spaces, see the details, and really think, you know, this is something that I can't get in a new building in Boston, and really creates a diversity of spaces for my employees that I'm not getting from all new construction. And as part of this exercise too, we identified the things that really, you know, kind of jumped up the block, didn't make it special. So this rooftop had a lot of equipment from all the additions that had gone on over the last 100 years. This is a view of Quaker Lane. This section, this yellow dotted line should be shifted over a little bit, but really was a later infill of the building. And so we looked at that as a way of connecting Quaker Lane to Congress Street and creating an interior passageway through it. And then just an example of a lot of these windows were filmed up, didn't have a great relationship with the street, no visibility and connection through the project. And so as part of our say logic of how the block evolves, how architecture evolves in the city over time, was really drilling in very carefully to the different eras that these buildings were built, looking at the structural capacities that each one of those buildings had, and then also making an argument for, you know, if this building has been built on, you know, from the early 1900s to the most recent addition in 1963, where they added an additional 3 stories into that U-shaped building, to filling in the door in the 80s, you know, why couldn't the next evolution of this project be a vertical addition that was on top of the building that just became that next kind of portion of its architecture and its architectural history? And how could we do that as architects without, you know, really interrupting or negating the existing architecture below? So some of our early diagrams for this were really looking at how we kind of set off from the old, the existing structure, and then create a space between the old and new, and then using these different roof decks to really create a whole series of outdoor spaces that could be occupied, could become outdoor work zones, and really kind of reconnect this building back into the city through its views and through the activity that was happening on the site. And so that resulted in a proposal like this, which we had presented to the BCDC as part of our Article 80's approvals process, you know, really looking at how these different roof decks could be tenant amenities and used for outdoor workspaces. And then kind of a fun little known fact about the project, we actually went in originally to get this permitted with just a simple 3-story addition. And the idea for this was, let's look at the existing structural capacity of the building. What could this building support without us doing significant structure work? We could keep the existing core in place for the elevator. We went in with a 3-story building, left that first meeting, the ECDC kind of full meeting where we introduced the project, and Related asked us to design a 7-story addition for the project. And so we kind of flipped real quick in the middle of that summer, designed a 7-story, actually a 6-story addition with a penthouse, a roof deck on top, and developed what kind of a version of what you see here on the right. And it was really, for us, kind of this question of proportions at that point, because the 3-story, we had set it up where it is less visible from the street, it kind of disappears on top, and then with 6 stories in a penthouse, your proportions are essentially the same for the existing versus new, and how we create these different carves and sculpt the building in order to create basically a framing of the existing architecture from below. And so really we went into this project with kind of these 3 main questions. How do we reconnect these buildings to the city, give them new life by opening them up to the city, as well as kind of preserving them for years and decades into the future? how do we create a sustainable office building that really adapts to the changing needs of the workplace? Again, this was pre-COVID, so we had no idea what was coming, but you know, thinking about this different type and quality of spaces that we could all work in, and really integrating the historic elements in without copying it. You know, there are a lot of times, you know, you get pressure from the various historic and landmark agencies to kind of make an exact copy or replica on top. And so we did not take that approach here. And so instead we developed really a series of diagrams that talks about how our thinking developed for this project. And so looking at the typical box and kind of the volume that we needed to do on top of this building to support the development, angling it back to respond really to the buildings and the views that you got as you moved up from Post Office Square and down from the Common. And a lot of this was looking at how this addition is perceived from the different corners, and begins to sculpt kind of from those different areas. And so that corner of Post Office Square, which is down here, really lifts up and responds to that view corridor. This volume on the Devonshire Street side broke into two more vertical volumes so that as you viewed it from the street, that mass began to shift away and angle away from you. And then really looking at how we reconnect and revitalize Quaker Lane, which was currently used as trash and loading for the city. So we took out this facade and basically proposed that the new glass curtain wall come down in the faceted vertical approach that is also visible from the City Hall approach, and then creating a second entrance for that main tenant at the end of Quaker Lane. Hyatt Centric is on the right, and then this was permitted to be developed into residential, some retail at the base. So again, kind of playing up the historic fire escapes on this view as well. And then really looking at how we occupy the new roof, bringing people up to that street. We have about 10,000 square feet of new roof deck that we brought into this building, both on that lower roof, which was leased out by Easy Cater on the inside, and then these two upper roof decks, one on each corner of the building and then at the top of the roof. And this was ultimately leased by Digitas and Publicis, who consolidated their headquarters into this building, taking both the old and the new floors. And a lot of the work, you know, as you look at adapting and reusing buildings in the city, is figuring out, you know, the pragmatics of trash, of loading, of core, how we thread the kind of new core through. This one, the light well, you can see remnants of it here. It actually went down to floor 3, kind of that whole light well within the center. So this is the existing plans and the footprints that we had. Each one of these had different levels. We surveyed all the different levels, figured out how to connect them in as one single office tenant. An early proposal, you can see how we were looking at bringing Quaker Lane through. This is Water Street here and Congress Street. We were originally trying to get another entry off of Congress Street. This ended up being turned into basically a new 6 elevator core that threaded up through that light well. And then looking at how we bring in accessibility to the 40 Water Street entrance, which was really had this kind of your main entrance here, which was the bronze pediment. We basically lowered and cut into this floor here so we could get an accessible route up with a small elevator tucked in there. And then we had the hotel plan. This was a restaurant that we connected into the existing building, and then the residential. And then an example of kind of what we also run into on a number of these adaptive reuse projects are conversations around the width of the sidewalk, the amount that we have left for complete streets. And so in this case, this was a section through Congress Street, which if anybody's walked there is pretty narrow. We're limited by the building footprint. And this, you know, got into a discussion where we were asked by the city and some of the early conversations, well, why can't you just cut into 35 Congress and the National Shawmut Bank and arcade this entire facade as it went along the street? We pushed back on that. We felt like it was important to preserve the existing buildings, one for the square footage that was needed for those tenants, but also because you can see really the difficulties of, even if we did push into it, connecting to them at street level where the floor levels are much higher than the actual street. So This is a conversation that we continue to have as architects, where you look at the intimacy that is provided in some of these historic neighborhoods in Boston and realize, that's really your value of moving through the city and kind of the quality of being able to experience that historic streetscape for what it was. And so these diagrams show really the level of detail that we started to get into, both in looking at the facade in terms of the existing grills. This was the only entrance in from 40 Water Street, so we basically came up this very steep set of stairs right here. The Monks building, which was another historic building by Peabody and Stearns, is back in this corner, and none of these really joined and connected. And so we said, what if we, use the center of this building for the light well, where we put in our new elevator core, lower this floor down to create a more welcoming lobby experience, and then create this interior street that runs through to Quaker Lane. And then the rest of the lobby was preserved. It had these kind of great coffered ceilings, along with more decorative iron metalwork that all lined the lobby around Water Street. And that's now all visible when you walk down Water Street. You can look up and into the building and see the historic space there. Just some of the diagrams that we looked at as we made our case to both the BLC, the BPA, and the BPDA at the time, why it was important to get visibility into the building, how we could still preserve some of the historic metalwork at the bottom, but remove some of the bars that really made that oblique view in really difficult and challenging. And then these diagrams show the upper floor, and so you can see kind of the amount of mechanical and bathrooms and other shop space that was just added over time. And what we did with the typical floor plates at the lower level was really clean it up, put in a central core, the elevators, the 2 stairs, instead of, I don't remember quite how many stairs we had, like 4 or 5 that were appearing on all different floors. And as you went down a floor, the column that you thought was going to be there just disappeared. In many of those cases where Consigli would call us up, GC for the project, the column's gone, it's not in the plans. So you're kind of continuously encountering these as you're going through the construction administrations.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the aspects of the project, really thinking beyond the traditional viability of using the existing buildings and having a modern office space, but really what are the building performance impacts? And specifically, I want to talk about embodied carbon and operational carbon and how we thought about that as part of the process of really trying to preserve as much of the existing building or buildings as we could. So a lot of analysis, Amy, you kind of alluded to it already, of trying to understand what all the different floor levels are and the different structural components. Part of structure is also understanding fire ratings and what's really in there, and doing a lot of different investigation of all the different buildings and additions over time to be able to come out with a holistic approach to say, we can preserve, this, we can't preserve that. And how does that feed into the overall conversation of when we say existing buildings and we think about embodied carbon, we say it's great to use an existing building, but if you have to, demolish 90% of it, you kind of lose that embodied carbon that's already built up in the existing building. And so that's something that really takes really a lot of thought and just really analysis. And we obviously have a great team, or had a great team for this project, to be able to understand all of those components. And go to the next slide.
This was showing typical floor condition at each of the lower floors. And really the question here was, would we be able to preserve and keep this visible for the tenant spaces while still getting the fire rating that we needed between the floors? And unfortunately, the answer was no. We ended up doing a coating along the bottom, but we were able to basically save the 3 layers of terracotta that were kind of basically forming the floor structure of every floor. And then we poured a lightweight concrete on the top in order to create a new, more level slab for the tenants.
So you can see here that core area, which a portion of that was that existing light well. And really to be able to make the building work holistically, you know, for a single tenant, you really need to think about consolidating and creating that new core. The way that the floor plan was originally just wouldn't really work. It wouldn't make it viable. And so it's a balance between putting in the new infrastructure and saving as much as we can on the existing. So we were able to, again, reuse some of that light well. Obviously, we're still cutting out a portion of the existing floor plate in the middle to insert this. One thing we worked on here was the addition, because the addition is what makes the development viable and you know, is an important part of the project. One thing we had to do was to obviously make sure we could structurally support those floors of the addition above. And so we did take out the structure of the roof, so the full roof structure, but we kept most of the floor structure of the other floors. We inserted the core in the middle. We located new columns that are really more around the perimeter, which helped have more of an open space on the ground floor and then the lobby space. And so that was really something that, you know, 7 years ago when we started this, embodied carbon was something we were really thinking about. We weren't calculating as much as we do today. We're now on all of our projects, we do a tally analysis. And we've done an analysis like this on other projects after Congress Square of looking at the shoring that's potentially needed versus what can you keep in place. And on this project, you know, we tried to minimize, but there is some temporary shoring. If it's steel, it's going to be recycled and that's great, but it's not staying in the building. And so it's something that we, you know, really tried to work through here, and on subsequent projects really focus more on how can you make sure everything that you have to put in there to get the new infrastructure can really be, you know, maintaining in place and not being removed. And so this is just a look at the reuse calc of the project. And again, the big piece was that we had to remove the roof structure in order for the addition to go on, but we were able to really try to salvage all of the other structure and facades and floors of the rest of the buildings. In addition to the embodied carbon, we also did a passive house analysis on the existing building, because reducing the operational carbon was obviously also a big piece of the project. And so we ultimately did not design the existing building to passive house, but it was something that we worked through not only from the facade and trying to understand, you know, how would we really insulate and make an airtight building. There was a lot of thermal bridging issues and trying to understand how we could overcome some of those issues. And then of course we looked at the mechanical systems and looked at alternates that could meet the passive house requirements. We were looking at the NRFIT PHI certification for this in our study. Ultimately, we didn't go in that direction. You know, we did insulate the exterior wall and improve the air tightness, but just not to the passive house level. And another component of that also was the windows, and the windows were not at end of life. They were fairly had fairly newly been replaced. And so that was part of the conversation as well, that it just doesn't make sense to replace those windows. And so we, you know, worked on the pieces that we wanted to improve. And then obviously when those windows get replaced, there's a way for them to tie in and to kind of improve the envelope as well. But it wasn't something that we felt, again, we're sort of thinking about embodied carbon. Why would you replace a window that has 20 years life left in it? Maybe that doesn't make sense. So we try to incorporate some components of it. But that was something that it was, for us, was the first sort of passive house study we did on a historic or existing building of that size. And so it's sort of an interesting understanding of what we would need to do to bring that up to that standard.
So this is just,
go ahead.
yeah, this is just a view of the overall building addition. And as Kate mentioned, the columns that were supporting this addition, it was really 14 super columns that we drilled down and through near the perimeter of the existing structure. And so on the aerial view, you can see these little squares that were left out and kind of blocked out of each floor. And then all those super columns were threaded through that. And then to support both the core and those columns, we had a whole series of mini piles that had to be basically drilled in the existing basement. And so they got the rig in there to drill the piles, and we basically ended up with, like, in some places, inches between the top of the pile drilling and the floor above. And so it was a lot of construction logistics for this in terms of how we bring the equipment into the building, how do we get things out of the building, and how do we do this in a very tight and limited urban site. And then the views, again, from the top of that existing addition, are basically kind of 180 degrees to the city in the area beyond. So you can see all the way to Boston Commons. And then just some finished images of the building. Again, kind of the experience at night, lighting up kind of that space between old and new, which we had kind of looked at as really this third space. Architecture. This is a view of, we didn't get into this building for this conversation, but the Newport building on the right, and then the horizontal addition that we did for Hyatt Centric is in this volume here. And this was also kind of an interesting case study in that we prefabbed it all off-site. This facade went up in 13 days as it was brought to the city, just in time delivery. And then the view from Devonshire and Water Street right here. And so really breaking down and looking at how this volume is experienced and perceived from the street level, thus as this larger super. And then here, this is really the space between the original National Shawmut Bank building, the Monks building by Peabody and Stearns is on the right, and we designed the perspectives a little bit off of this one, but basically this crease where the soffit comes down to line up perfectly with the space in between the two buildings. And so that registers as the facade tilts in, it basically presents itself as a much thinner profile depending on where you're viewing it in different areas of the city. View of that gap in between, which was then replaced by the curtain wall. And we really looked at this as a way to add value to the inside of those spaces going vertically up through the building when you have one of those existing 10 floors, because a lot of the talk was, okay, I've got these fabulous floors on the top of my building, almost column-free spaces, unobstructed views around the city. What makes these lower floors special? And so you can basically sit, we have this kind of little platform that got incorporated into a lot of the Digitas and Publicis interior design work by Elkis. And then Easy Cater did some similar space planning on the interior design on the interior, and really kind of these really beautiful views out to Faneuil Hall, get these glimpses of the copper fire escapes on the inside. So it's again kind of using those moments of what you would think would be something that you could plan interior space around to make that the focal point of the space. This is there were trusses on the third floor of the National Shawmut Bank building that were basically supporting and holding up the ceiling above their data center when we moved in. And so this was interior design for the Easy Cater space as well. And then finally, just image of the roof deck, some of the lower levels, Easy Cater moving in, and then just a couple of quick other shots from Water Street. The big part of this was, how do we add color to the city? So many of our cities are just gray, bland, and we used the soffit and some of the new architecture to create those moments of reflectivity, of bringing light down to the street, and injecting some fun into it.
Thank you, Amy and Kate. That was really interesting. It makes me want to get back out and explore my city a little bit more fully. All right, let's go on to post-it 200.
I will be sharing my screen momentarily. I just can't find the right one, even though we did a test run.
Andrew or Maren, as Christina finds the slides, would you like to set the context for this?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you for having us. We're excited to be able, to be a part of the series and to share experience with Post-it 200 Smith. It was a thrill for us to be able to work with Anchorline on this project. We think they have such a strong vision, and we really wanted to start this portion of the presentation and talking about, the why and, what that vision was from day one. I think there was a lot of other folks that were looking at this site, and Andrew and his team had a different vision for this. So we thought we'd start there and then maybe get into some of the opportunities and challenges, and then talk about our design strategies.
Yeah, so I guess to try to answer that question, the why, we competed in a very long, drawn out process. The United States Post Office through the GSA was selling the property. CB represented it. It took about 9 months to complete the process, which is a little unusual for a product to sell over that type of period of time. But the shortlisted of the buyers to be the prospect buyers, we were the only ones looking at an adaptive reuse of the building. All of the other buyers were looking to tear the building down and utilize the 36-acre site it was on. We thought that was a bad idea just because there was timing. There would be a substantial amount of timing that would take place to redevelop it into a new structures. The neighborhood that you see directly across the street in this photo here is well organized and would have taken quite a bit of time to get through it, and if you were to be able to get through it at all. So we focused on sort of an as of right kind of reuse of the building, and we brought the team from CBT in to help us with it, because when you look at that photo there, the dimension of that sort of a large box it's roughly 500 by 500. So the concept of standing in the middle of that, you're 250 feet from a window. So we started with an in-depth sort of study on how do we get natural light into the center of the building. So with that, why don't Maureen, I'll turn it back over to you and let you take through some of the design decisions we got through.
Sounds great. Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so as Andrew said, it's a 36-acre site. The building was about 390,000 square feet before we came along of usable space. It was the United States Postal Service Processing Center. Largely no light in the building at all. It was clad in these CMU walls. It was a steel structure, but concrete floors, composite deck, and CMU walls mostly. But you see in these images, it just, it was quite bleak. So I think a lot of folks would look at this and say, wow, what, how can we make this into an enticing kind of sought after, really unique tenant space for office users, R&D, lab, etc. Here you see some of that interior, there's some interior before shots. And I think in terms of opportunities, there were a couple of things going for us. We had the column spacing, they were about a 40-foot bay, which actually works well for a lot of different uses. And if you want that kind of open office concept, R&D, industrial. So that was going for us. We also had a lot of head height in here. So in the original building, which was built, I think in 1968, most of the head height in there was about 15 feet. And then they came along in the mid 90s and built an addition to the building, which I think gave us a 27-foot height space. So there was a lot of opportunity there. The first thing we wanted to do was really look at how can we get some daylight in here. And again, the goal was to reuse as much as we could in terms of that original structure, but there were some challenges associated with those masonry block walls and bringing the light in. But you see the solid facades. There's a number of vents that run across the side. The roof is largely clean. That's another thing that was kind of going for us, giving us opportunity there. So there wasn't a lot of necessarily a lot of things to shift around from an infrastructure point of view. Another challenging aspect was this whole southern facade where the loading bays were. And then the grading also as there, the 4-foot grade change, and then along the side as you come down the building. So there were a number of things that we were kind of tackled with, but I think, for us and our team, we really look at these as fun challenges and fun problems to have, because it's always nice to find a unique solution for those things. But it was a massive footprint, as Andrew was saying, about 500 by 500. So this diagram really gets to kind of the very simple way of those first initial thoughts on how can we bring in daylight and fresh air into these spaces. So the first thing we knew, again, Andrew was talking about the as of right. So we had about 390,000 square feet of space. As of right would allow us about 40,000 more. So again, to make this a viable, really attractive offering, we wanted to take advantage of that 40,000. We also knew that we needed to get light and air in there. So carving out a large courtyard made a lot of sense, really trying to get into the center of that 500-foot span to be able to bring enough, as much light as we could into the space and to reduce that window to window line inside. And even though we had the large ceiling heights, it's still, we wanted to bring as much daylight as we could. And what you see here is larger than you would see in kind of a typical urban office setting, but because of those large ceiling heights, it really made for a beautiful space and a lot of light streaming into the space. So you'll see we carved out in the middle, it's about 14,000 square feet to get that courtyard. We deliberately did that off to the side, not on the south side, but coming off of the other. And a number of reasons for this. One is you drive into the site and kind of access it. The other side, kind of that southwest corner, is the one that you see from the highway. But as you're actually entering the site in a vehicle, that courtyard area, kind of the opening into the building, is kind of the first thing you see. So that's a really nice kind of entry point and gateway for the building. What you see in that third diagram, that kind of purple box, is where we decided to put the amenity center. So we knew we wanted that to be at the core of the building. When we were designing this, we didn't know if we were going to have a single user or multi-user scenario at the end of the day. So a lot of the design decisions were made around being flexible and having something that would work for both scenarios. So having that amenity center right in the middle, right off the courtyard, made an awful lot of sense. Another thing to note there, you see those little purple arrows. An important part of this in talking about if it was to be a multi-tenant scenario, wouldn't it be great if these tenants could have their own entry, off of the exterior, not have to go through a central core. So, situating the courtyard the way it was, placing it and sizing it the way we did, this allowed for those exterior entry points off the courtyard, which was a great feature to have at the end of the day. And then you see on those bottom images, again, that's just kind of the metrics there, how we got to the square footage in our as of right number. And then that last image shows kind of that entry shot. We knew that was a very important part of the design. We wanted that to be really spectacular and beautiful and eye-catching from the highway. And then you see that little green area, that little green strip is where the loading bays were. What we did was created a raised kind of dining terrace for the tenants. That's how we mitigated the grade change without too much site work. It also created just a wonderful amenity for the tenants. So here's a rendering of what that looks like now when you're thinking about the facades and you know, introducing glazing to the building, and the juxtaposition of the glazing versus the, you know, trying to keep as much masonry as we could, of course, overcladding that, but also bringing some warmth with some thermary decking on the facade. We thought that was an important part of the design process, as well as, you know, the greening up of the site, making it really inviting and eye-catching for the tenants. We'll get into the courtyard in a little bit. In terms of sustainability goals, so we were looking at this, I think it was in 2015 and 16 when we first started working on this. And, you know, conversations about embodied carbon were kind of just starting to happen as far as I'm aware. And so, you know, again, the goal was to reuse as much of the existing structure and infrastructure that we could, but while still bringing as much daylight as we could into the building. It was a LEED core and shell version 4 project. We tried to maximize the materials. We were very cognizant. We worked with Callahan on the construction and demolition waste management. We'll get to the window wall ratio in a little bit, but we were trying to introduce about 40% more glazing to the building, which was a challenge, but I think, you know, really made a difference. Sustainable sites, and then overall decrease in building energy and water use.
And overall, we used about 75.5% of the original building.
And then we get into some of the glazing studies. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure this out with the high bays, you know, understanding what that meant to make a comfortable, you know, place for tenants to be inside. So we ended up introducing a new overhang at the building's parapet edge, which helped with some of that the glare issues. We actually ended up, we originally were going to take off that canopy that was over the loading dock area, but ended up maintaining that because that too was helping with that daylighting and glare and kind of that comfort area in the dining terrace below. And then this is just a study to show it was about a 60-40 window wall ratio that we ended up. And again, that helped with our energy savings. You know, we tried to max out as much glazing as we could in the building, but we're also being cognizant of the energy usage and performance of the building overall.
I think if I could add one thing there to it, go back for 1 second. The spots that we didn't introduce glazing where we used the thermary, we spent a lot of time figuring out where to put them correctly. So in a multi-tenant scenario, tenants could use that as a backdrop for their branding, which really played well when it came to, you know, rendering it up for a tour or for a big meeting to drop in their logo right on those sections of the building that were sort of pre-designed as sort of, I would say, as frames for their logos without, you know, anything in the frames, so to speak. So.
And then again, more solar and daylighting analysis, talking about heat gain and, you know, glare issues. So a lot of effort was put into this. Again, just more studies on that. The introduction of that overhang at the top really made a difference. Lots of studies about how that space feels when you're in it. You know, from a thermal and visual comfort level. And then now we get into some of the finished product. So the revitalization of the building was complete in March of 2019. So that was the facade work, the core shell work, the courtyard, the site work. We had a welcome party in the spring of 2019, which was really fun. We ended up using, we love this photo of the mannequins because those were found on the site. So, you know, part of the fun storytelling for us is to talk about, Andrew's laughing, you know, to talk about some of those sustainability goals and some of the fun we had and just in the storytelling of the space in the building. Did you want to say something, Andrew? It looked like you were going to chime in there on this.
The mannequins. One of the mannequins made it to someone's summer house on my team, and they put it out every year for the Oscars. So he throws a big Oscar party. So if you come across a mannequin, spray paint it up, and you can have a great prop for a party.
The reuse and sustainable story continues.
Exactly.
And then we did the amenity center fit out in the fall of 2019. That was complete. It was about 15,000 square feet.
I know this is the developer side, but the nice part about that last slide is within 90 days, really within 60 days of completing the shell and core, we were 100% leased. So once we delivered the product and people saw it, I think it was the next 3 tours leased up the entire building.
Yeah, it really made for an amazing space. And I think too, we're finding all over tenants want that pride of place. So they're looking for that unique destination. They put their mark on something and say, oh, we're at that building. People know that building. So it's kind of fun. It's a great story. This is a little animation that was done to kind of show and get a feel for what that courtyard feels like. Again, it's nice. A lot of introduction of that warm thermarine material, glazing, this nice warm dark metal as a contrast to really what was there before. And then, the landscape and site components, the hardscaping, it's really quite clean yet inviting. It's a little bit playful. And I would say too that the branding and all the graphic elements were sophisticated yet playful. And I think that really plays well with the architecture and the story of the building.
I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the patterns that we used in the pavement were all postal code patterns as well. And they rolled through the signs, and our front step had the zip code on it, hence the name post for the building and the branding and things like that as a former postal facility. So there's sort of subtle branding that took place all throughout the building with that stuff.
Yeah, a little bit. Christina, do you want to talk about the amenities?
Absolutely. And then, so the amenities, Anchorline and CBT joined forces, and the goal was really to create something very unique, very exciting, especially for the suburban area. And I think once this construction was completed, as Andrew mentioned, it got tenants that were walking through very excited about the space and the potential here. So there's some really unique features such as a half court basketball, fitness center, individual fitness pods, which are especially prevalent through COVID, this great food hall that opens up to the courtyard with a nano wall. So on beautiful days, open that up and allow the daylight and space, interior outdoor feeling.
Not a whole lot of three-pointer shot in our basketball court, unfortunately, because of the ceiling height, but it's more taking it to the rim type basketball game.
So here are just some other photos of that space in the courtyard, populated with furniture to use throughout the beautiful weather.
And then we just have some, final photography. We have a fun little video to share with you at the end here, but this is the final product.
So this is that south
Corner that you see from
west corner that you see from the highway, Route 128, and is now home to the Boston Dynamics entrance. Some shots from the courtyard before it was fit out.
Yeah, to show, really inviting people to leave their space and be able to have direct access to the outdoors was an important feature as well. So even from those upper levels. in the courtyard.
In the chat, there was a question about the mezzanine construction. We utilized the space of the building that was, again, the 40 by 40 columns. To do the mezz, we actually added, made the column grid in that area 20 by 20 and added new footings for those, the additional columns we added to it. And it was a poured concrete. And we spent a lot of time studying to make sure we had the right ceiling heights above and below, and designing the systems in the roof to stay away from effectively from where the area of the mezz would go in. So there was a lot of work put into the design and construction of that mezz. And then I think there's another question in there about intentional use of wood texture on the facade. We really wanted to include some natural materials to the facade, again, to use it as sort of a framing for tenants to put their logos, which all of the tenants so far have utilized it. Backlit signs that sit on that section of the building. Waltham is a city that works well with tenants. It's not as onerous as other locations to put up building signage. So we've successfully put all of the signs up, and with the exception of the one on the corner that Boston Dynamics, have all been located on the sort of wood sections of the facade. And I think the last one that looks like wants to talk about the roof. Our roof design, specifically our HVAC design, was done custom to each tenant. So we used the existing systems to, I would say, limp through our construction, and then our shell and core and our build out. And then we built use specific HVAC systems to each tenant for their population and as well as their use. So one of the tenants that leased space from us is a group called Elevate Bio, which is a small batch manufacturing facility of drugs. So their systems are far more elaborate than, for example, Decipher or Boston Dynamics systems, which are more intended, one for robotics lab and office space, and the other one for really just straight office space. So we sort of did their design of the roof, but didn't put the systems in until we identified the tenants and their needs. So.
And there's some fun photos here of the opening event that was both Kentucky Derby themed and just really unique with pops of color. And throughout the space, especially this bar area where you would check in, we reused materials that were salvaged from the sorting facility. So like these wood boards were reused from the wall paneling. And then, so they're reused for this event, and then finally became the bar for the amenity center. So there's a little bit of a sustainable story throughout the series of events.
A couple, you gotta point out a couple more of those light fixtures there. You gotta talk about those.
I know these were old docking bay lighting that we again reused. I think the locker bench, the seat of the locker benches. So created some custom, really quirky elements here. These were electrical spools used during construction that we found and just created a custom chandelier with. So that was a lot of fun, really fast process, but that it just kind of made us think outside the box, and then loved the sustainable story of reusing it throughout 3 phases. And then this was just an example of how these 40-foot bays could be set up for tenant use.
You can see the daylight in this space is just amazing. It just really penetrates deep into that floor plate, making it really nice for the tenants.
Something like that. So here you can see the Boston Dynamics signage utilized on that ePay section. And then a lot of fun happening on the site. But we get a kick out of this for not only the robots and use of space, but just being able to see our space, the interior of the space being utilized successfully. So I don't know if anybody caught the 60 minutes footage, but
That was it for our portion of the presentation. Thank you, Jean.
I just want to loop back to a couple of questions. On this project, did you think about adding floors going up, or was there a cost analysis of that done?
You know, we did look at that, and again, we were limited by how much we had by right on the FAR. So we knew we could utilize what we had by right inside with the mezzanine and create a more dynamic interior space. We felt that was the best reuse of the square footage. I think the present owner, we've since sold this building. We sold it last April. I think is looking at adding additional floors and going through a typical process with the city to do so. But our process, we took it through. Again, we wanted to stay in the as of right because it was when the post office moved into this building and did this development in the early 90s. It was heavily contentious with the neighborhood, and frankly, it was a torturous type of use to live across. At one point, they were running 3 shifts here, so 24 hours a day. 1,500 people worked in the building, and trucks coming in and out of the street and the beeping and all that stuff 24/7. So we knew that neighborhood wasn't going to be a very friendly one. That's why we got away from that relatively quick to stay as of right to renovate as well.
I think internationally we're seeing a lot more incentive and pressure to reuse existing buildings, but I feel like both of these projects are in many ways ahead of their time. But as part of that, there are questions in the chat about your operational energy and your energy sources, which are also a rapidly changing conversation. So particularly, for instance, within the city of Boston, did the Arrowstreet development team look at it? I assume the building is not all electric, but did it look at that for the post at 200 Smith? One of the questions about the roof was, did you look at the opportunities for photovoltaics, on-site photovoltaics for this project? And I'm assuming that building is not all electric either. So as a postdoc, so that's one question. What are the energy sources? Did you look at alternative energy sources? Let's stop there, and then I have a follow-up question from the chat.
I can talk to you about the solar. We were approached to do solar on the roof of Post. I think it will happen. We were unwilling to engage in it until we had our tenants identified and their systems designed. We sold the building, frankly, before one of the 3 tenants even moved in. So I would be shocked if Healthpeak, who's a great owner of real estate, doesn't pursue that, both on the roof as well in the parking lots. There's some great southern parking lots with some great solar exposure there. So that's something that I think will come to the building, but we couldn't execute on it until we had properly designed and leased our space. So.
And it's not an all electric building, correct?
It is not. No.
Okay. I didn't presume, but I just wanted to check. And Amy, do you want to speak to or Kate to the energy source conversations about your building?
Yep. So Congress Square is not an all electric building. We started the project, you may remember more, 7 or 8 years ago. And we did look at all electric systems when we did the passive house study. We looked at various heat pump scenarios and VRF. I think today we're seeing projects in downtown Boston that are going all electric because the technology and the ability has really just changed to be able to make that happen, even in the last 7 years, which is exciting. But it doesn't mean that project and that building at Congress Square can't be all electric in the future. So that's something that we didn't, have to, plan any specific infrastructure for. But it's something that we know as the technology evolves, if they wanted to, produce the natural gas boilers and have more heat pumps in that mechanical spaces, they can do that. So that is a component of how we did the building, and sort of consolidating the mechanical systems will allow them to be able to do that.
Did either project calculate what your operational carbon is per year based on your energy sources and projected operational modeling?
We definitely have that. We would have had the emissions as part of our lead analysis, even though that's not what, although I think we actually use the alternative compliance path for lead. So I think we did submit that as one of our pieces, not just reduction by cost. I don't have that number top of my head, but we definitely would have that.
I'm not a huge fan of EUI, so but I am curious to know if either one of you are willing to share what your energy utilization intensity is on a square foot basis, or if you know it. It might obviously
it's more that I don't know it off the top of my head. But again, we would have that from our modeling. It's just been a few years since I've
We're welcome to share that project. We can follow up and share later.
And I know that Kate, you mentioned Arrowstreet's running a tally analysis on all of their projects. This is pretty extensive tally analysis to have done, but I would be curious to know if you did run tally on the reuse, and whether you did a comparison of what a new construction project, the embodied carbon savings versus operational carbon versus compared to a new building. Have you done that comparison?
We did, not specifically on Congress Square, but a similar project, in Boston, kind of similar size and sort of scope of looking at, how much to save, how much to take down, and then what would happen if it was all new construction. We did run analysis on that. I think, and I was kind of mentioning a little bit in our presentation, that the big component of that is making sure that anything that you have to put in to support, say, a new core, because a lot of these buildings, especially when you're talking about buildings that are been built up as additions over time, and now you're kind of combining it all as one, you're going to have a new core structure, and making sure that whatever you put in for that saves as much of the floor plate, but also that any what would have been more thought of as temporary shoring, that there isn't temporary shoring, right? That you try to make everything that you put in new on site stays on site. So that's something that we kind of, in that analysis, we did look at Congress Square and saw like where we did end up with some temporary shoring there, and then tried to think about, well, how would you do that differently? What would that look like? How would the structure be different? And so the analysis did show that if you're really thoughtful about making sure you're maintaining the majority of the existing structure and envelope, and again, envelope was a big component to that. We looked at the envelope, so we were assuming that we were using existing openings, and if we need to replace windows, that's what we were doing, as opposed to making large openings to it. And the embodied carbon was definitely less than the existing, than a full new construction project. So I think that's really where you have to think about, is those points of, how much are you keeping? Facade's a really big component to it. And then the infill, or the new pieces, because you'll have to do something new, most likely, when you're talking about adaptive reuse, and making sure that that's not as intrusive as you can make it. And then making sure you're thinking about all of the different components of construction, because sometimes you might not even think about temporary shoring, but it's a really significant piece. And talking about structural steel, it's not a 2x4 brace. So that's kind of the important pieces to think about.
Andrew, you mentioned that your team was the only team that was looking at building reuse, and you tied the building reuse, actually, I believe, to time, to speed of being able to bring the project online. Does Anchorline typically focus on existing buildings, and is is do you find that in existing buildings you have a quicker turnaround from start to finish in order to bring the project online?
So we do focus primarily on adaptive reuse, whether it's our project we did at Crosspoint, the old Wang Towers. We did an adaptive reuse, the lobby and the entry pass and the amenities there. We're in the process of we're the co-development team with JLL at One Post Office Square, which is a pretty extensive adaptive reuse there. We're also about to start to break ground on the adaptive reuse of the Sears department store at the Cambridge Site Galleria, where the skin will come off that and we'll actually add 2 floors to it. So yes, I would say it is our primary goal is to fix the product. It's frankly, it goes back to the old fix it, lease it, and sell it, right? That's kind of the core of our business. So yeah, the time element is it's a lot quicker to once you've figured it out, which it takes a lot more effort to figure it out, frankly, than it is to design something and build something new. But the process goes quicker, and specifically the process with the permitting process, so to speak. You can get through that in a much easier way than if we were going in, and one of the competitors at Post wanted to build 750,000 square foot buildings. A campus of 3 buildings to make 750,000 square feet. That would have taken them 2 to 3 years of a public process. Where ours, because we're by right, we engaged with the public and explained to them what we're doing and won their approval, but wasn't required for us to do the project. We did it anyways because it was the right thing to do. But as a result, from when we bought the building to when we started construction was under 6 months. So that's the ultimate sort of win for us, is to deliver it quicker because markets change and they change quickly, and we wanted to sort of stay in quote unquote this market by getting through a process faster and delivering an interesting product too. I think if we had tore it down and built something new, I'm not sure it would have been as interesting. Probably, I think the Congress Square crowd would definitely say new construction isn't as interesting as what they delivered as well too. There's a lot of unique characters to both these buildings that you don't want to throw away, frankly. You want to take advantage of.
One of the questions in the chat was whether for each of these buildings, if you had to pick one memorable challenge that might have been different from your other projects, could you pick your favorite or the challenge that you most want to celebrate out of all the many that both of you named?
I can think of one. I know for us, the structural grid, it was less than reliable. And so there's a lot of, site work and field work to try to figure out what exactly was built and how, and, figuring out all the nuances of the detail of where things start and stop is largely dependent on where those existing members were, and being able to celebrate those and work around them without too many, heartaches or challenges during construction. We tried to get ahead of that up front, and that was no small feat.
Kate, Amy, would you narrow it down to one challenge that you remember with real, beyond all of them that you?
There were a lot, but I'm really proud of how we reimagined the entry off of 40 Water Street. We made it accessible, and I feel like we did it within the historic integrity of that building. They had all those really strong traditional columns and the colonnade on the front, and being able to work with how the street grade changed there, get an accessible entry in while still preserving the main center entry, which was so symmetrical as part of the story of the building. And then creating a really special lobby space that has the old and the new elements and woven together was a nice kind of challenge that resulted in, I think, a really great interior space.
I really appreciated how you mentioned the relationship of the building to the sidewalks, and holding true to that, because I do feel like that is in preservation terms, it's almost a defining characteristic, that nature of the city. And I find myself thinking, in 50 to 100 years, that character may not be driven as much by cars. So hence I feel like it becomes even more important to hold on to it as we see our cities changing. But I am curious, Lori Ferris from our office, who helped design this series and who's, I believe, on the call, has done a great deal of analysis of the buildings that we work on academic centers. And hence she has said in many of her papers that building reuse is climate action. We believe from the analysis she's done that it is probably the most potent climate action, because what we see is that building reuse can, even with moderate energy improvements, moderate operational energy improvements, the carbon expended to improve the building versus the carbon needed to run the building still has a, quote, payback of just a few years, as opposed to the payback of a new high performance building may take decades. And since many of us don't think we have decades, we're all for reusing what we already have. But you two have presented projects that really were happening long before the conversation about the renewed conversation about embodied climate and climate change. Do you feel like, as you have finished these projects and as you're beginning your new projects, that there is more appetite or support for building reuse, and because of climate change, or has the whole picture of development, is it shifting both within our metropolitan region? Is the conversation about climate change shifting it at all? I know Andrew's looking at I hope you're not too close to the ocean, Andrew, because we're going to talk about ocean rise next. But
fortunately, we're at a good elevation that we'll be fine wherever we are. But I think, to your question about are people pushing for adaptive reuse, I think they should, frankly, I think they should be. Some buildings shouldn't be thrown away. I think of just the amount of concrete we would have had to pour if we tore that building down and built a new one. I mean, we would have been adding 400,000 square feet of concrete. I mean, I stood on that mezzanine, which is only 40,000 square feet, the day after they poured it, and it was middle of January, and you could have worn shorts and a t-shirt, the amount of energy that was coming out of that concrete as it was coming together. So I think that the concrete alone that we saved, and the wear and tear that would put on the roads, and the carbon fibers of trucks bringing it, and never mind the equipment making it, that alone, we stood there and we said, this isn't going to show up in any Lee report or there's no sort of points for this, so to speak, but we all felt very good that we weren't ripping out some things that you didn't have to replace. You just had to have a more creative mind and a more creative team to work on it with you to try to figure it out, because we showed that first chart in the beginning with the courtyard and other things that we added to it. It looks very simple when you put it on that one slide, and I credit the CBT for showing it being that simple, but it took us thousands of man hours trying to figure out the right solution for that. So that's ultimately the challenge we all will have as we face other projects like this, is do you want to make that investment, or do you want to take kind of the easy way out, which is say, let's just tear it down and design something new.
And I think that it's partly market driven too. I think, the market is changing a bit from what tenants are looking for. I think there's a lot of competition out there these days. And I think that folks are looking for that unique space, something that has some history and some story, and something that they can really put their name on and be proud of, and to be a part of that. And I think the adaptive reuse, it just provides something that's, oftentimes more unique than what you might get with a ground up building. And I think tenants are looking for that.
I would agree. And there's so many intangibles in terms of measuring the value of adaptive reuse. I mean, as Andrew mentioned, the Post leased up incredibly quickly, and we found the same for 40 Water Street in terms of the types of tenants it was attracting. But how do you put that metric back into your pro forma? I think the easiest way to look at it is the as of right, and the difficulty that you would have, and especially in the city of Boston, in terms of building a 35-story tower in the middle of downtown versus doing something more modest. That becomes a little bit more tangible, and certainly I would say probably informed Related's approach to taking a more a scaled back development proposal forward and getting it approved. And we did it in record time. Within 5 months, over one summer, we got it from submitted for Article 80 to ECDC approval for the entire block, which was really unheard of at that time. And a lot of it is credited to kind of a more minimal approach to architecture. And I don't think in our profession that is valued as much as bigger, kind of tallest building. But I think from these presentations, you can definitely see the value of the stories and the value of what makes these buildings and what makes our city special.
Well, I believe that building reuse is actually the most potent climate action we can take, because why wouldn't we reuse our biggest objects besides just our grocery bags? It's just, to me, has always been common sense, and the ability to analyze it more effectively has started to make the case to prove it. And it will be part of the conversation at COP26 in Glasgow in the fall, thanks in large part to the Climate Heritage Network that Lori is part of. But I wonder if, as we try to grapple with these issues, would either team be able to identify policy changes or economic changes that would further your ability to do these amazingly wonderful projects? I'll give you.
It's a great question.
I want you to ask for a carbon tax, Andrew, on material.
Honestly, it's a great question. I haven't thought philosophically about that. I've always, when we look at them, we always kind of, as you can tell, we kind of sort of try to stay within the box that we're given. But I don't know what the impact is, and I used concrete as an example earlier, but I don't know what the impact is on it specifically. But I think that should be part of the conversation, that as a developer, that I should, like, when I whatever measure I'm held to, whether it's passive or LEED or whatever that is, there should be a level of credit or points that go into reusing it, because, for example, on our Sears building, it's a similar thing where it's a new facade going on an existing structure. We're losing points because we're reusing it. We're competing what they're doing next door at the mall, where they're gonna, at 20 Cambridge side, they're gonna tear down the Macy's and build a high-rise tower. They'll have a higher LEED ranking than we will. So in the competitive market, they're more attractive to a different user that values those things. So it becomes a bit frustrating for someone like me that does a lot of reuse projects, that we feel like the benefit of what we're doing should be sort of, I say, quote unquote, scored higher by the community. And how you would do that sort of policy wise, I would defer to other people, but that's kind of the on the ground thought process that we have.
So that talks about the certification systems. Amy or Kate, were you going to say something?
I was just going to add to that I think two things that really would need to work in conjunction that I would like to see is I'd like to see more energy code require things of existing building renovations that they don't today. The sort of, if you touch it, you upgrade it. If you don't, you leave it. I think really isn't going to help marry the importance on the embodied carbon side of keeping existing buildings with the operational carbon. So I'd love to see that, but I think on the same side, you need to have the incentive side of it. So being able to incentivize existing buildings, historic tax credits are great, but a lot of buildings are historic, but that doesn't mean there aren't great things about them and there aren't great reasons to reuse them. So I think it really needs to come from both sides of regulation. I think we do need more regulation, especially from the operational carbon side on existing buildings, but we definitely need more incentive components. And I'm not going to sit here and say where that should come from. Maybe it's a carbon price, but some way to incentivize, I think, is also really.
Sergio is mentioning in the chat something that I said imperfectly, that the time value of carbon is incredibly critical. So the point of reusing what we already have is that we reduce the amount of carbon that we're expending now to replace it, that we don't have decades to create a perfect world. We need to really bring our carbon use down now. The sooner we bring it down, the sooner our chances are of really addressing the Paris Agreement. But I just wanted to loop back a little bit to the incentives. Would it be something that would be useful, for instance, should we be advocating for higher tipping fees for waste removal? Should we, Kate, I think that what I heard you say, and you'll have to correct me, is that we shouldn't overly obsess about reducing operational energy if the comparison of operational energy to building reuse actually creates a better project for the climate. Is that what you said?
That's not exactly what I said, but I would agree with that too. Maybe there should be, I didn't go that far, but maybe the code should be looking at full life cycle energy and not just focus on operational. Because yes, if your carbon footprint, might be a balance between operational and embodied, obviously that might look different when an existing project versus a new construction project.
A holistic analysis of carbon in the building code would make my heart soar like a swallow or something. I can only imagine us moving to a world that is not a single issue voting, that we're really thinking more holistically about what we're doing to improve the quality of the world. So I think we're just at time. I think we've addressed everything in, and I'm being reminded that we have closing slides and that we have a partnership. We want to thank Spalding Brick Company again. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's been wonderful to participate in, and to all of our many partners who include the AIA chapters and Built Environment Plus and Boston Preservation Alliance, as well as IFMA, which is an important partner for us. And we want to remind you of the upcoming conversations and hope that you'll bring your thoughts and questions to those. Caitlin, am I allowed now to stop and say, I just want to say thank you so much to the presenters. These were such exciting, wonderful projects. I haven't been to either of them, and now I cannot wait. I won't wait for the parties. I'll just renew my engagement with the city and with Waltham, where I don't have a lot of engagements, but now I see a reason to do it. So thank you again to everybody who participated, and particularly to the speakers, and to Caitlin for shepherding us through this. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Take care.